I would like them to take back the Concordat made with Adolf Hitler, the first treaty he ever signed, giving the church a monopoly over education in Germany in exchange for the dissolution of the Catholic Centre Party to give the Nazi Party a clear run.
The 1933 Concordat with Germany was not the first treaty signed by the Nazi government after they came to power. It was preceded by the Four Powers Pact signed with Great Britain, France, and Italy about a week before the Concordat. Mr. Hitchens has stepped on a bit of a hornet's nest with this one, as he includes criticisms regarding
the fact that Father Tiso, head of the Nazi puppet state in Slovakia, was a priest in holy orders, that the Croatian fascist puppet state, the Ustaša state of Ante Pavelić, was also operating under full clerical protection and disguise, as was the regime of General Franco. And I really think I would beg forgiveness for this. I don't think the German church should have asked Hitler's birthday to be celebrated from the pulpit every year until he died, and for silence during Hitler's final solution, or Shoah.
I'll throw in the Vatican rat lines as well. All of these fall under an intense historical debate known as the Pius Wars, the debate about Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958, written about ad nauseum by critics and apologists. Both sides, I believe, are guilty of contorting evidence to suit their agenda. So while I have not read all of the books on the topic, I have done my best to read the most respected, and also John Cornwell. The previously mentioned topics each warrant their own video, and the Holocaust warrants multiple. Much like a similarly named saga, everyone will probably be disappointed at some point in this series.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
This installation will reflect the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany up to the circumstances surrounding the Concordat signed with Hitler in July of 1933. Anti-Semitism inevitably comes up when talking about the rise of the Nazis. I've already done a video on this topic in my review of David Kurzer's book, The Popes Against the Jews, but much more could and should be said. I will not be touching on that here, as there's plenty for me to cover in regards to the rise of the Nazis. I will be addressing that in some capacity when I tackle the Holocaust and the anti-Semitic measures of the Nazis more specifically. For now, I want to keep my focus on three events that are often argued to be interconnected, and they are as follows. The Catholic Center Party voting for the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933, the German Catholic bishops repealing their condemnation of National Socialism on March 28, 1933, the signing of the Concordat with Nazi Germany on July 20, 1933. How these events relate to each other remains a heated historical debate. I will try to briefly summarize the two schools of thought. On one hand, you have Klaus Scholder arguing these events must have been orchestrated from a top-down approach. The argument goes something like this. The Vatican wanted to sign a Concordat with Germany and needed a strong central government to do so. To obtain a strong central government, they advocated for the Catholic Center Party to vote for the Enabling Act. In addition, they also removed the condemnation of the National Socialist Party to demonstrate their approval of Catholics being loyal to the Reich and their faith at the same time. The Concordat was very generous in its terms to the Vatican as a response, and Hitler was able to get a boost in international standings with the diplomatic victory along with the loyalty of the German Catholics. An alternative view defended by Conrad Repgen is the pressure was a result from a bottom-up approach. Due to the threat of violence against them, and with some vague reassurances from Hitler in speeches regarding the role of Christianity in Germany, the Center Party reluctantly voted for the Enabling Act in hopes that the support for Hitler would protect their institutions against his violent brigade. Due to the Catholic doctrine of obedience to civil authority and the nature of that new civil authority, the ban against the National Socialist Party was lifted by the bishops despite acknowledging the party's failure to amend itself. With these two concessions already made, the Catholic Church had little leverage left against the National Socialist government, and the Vatican had not much option but to accept the generous terms that were at least offered on paper. If nothing more, it would at least provide grounds for legal protests against the inevitable violations. Now, neither of these scenarios makes the Catholic Church look great. On one hand, you have a puppet master pulling the strings on a political situation far from his doors that leads to giving one of the most evil men in history unlimited power. On the other, you have members of the faith expecting concessions and compromises to have a moderating influence on a government explicit in its violent intentions. To weigh the more likely scenario, we have to take into account the political realities of the Vatican dating back to early German unification. Starting when Hitler becomes Chancellor in January 1933, like the top documentary on this topic on YouTube does, is dishonest for multiple reasons that I will get into.
To understand this, we must go back to the beginning of the 1930s. More precisely, January the 30th, 1933.
With that, we begin with Bismarck in 1870s Germany. The new German state was outwardly hostile toward the Catholic Church. Bismarck viewed the international Catholic influence as nefarious for his newly formed state and engaged in a culture war against it. Priests and bishops were imprisoned. Richard Evans,
What?
Not that, Rich Evans. That one says the following. By the mid-1870s, 989 parishes were without incumbents. 225 priests were in the gaol. All Catholic religious orders, apart from those involved in nursing, had been suppressed. 2 archbishops and 3 bishops had been removed from office, and the Bishop of Trier had died shortly after his release from 9 months in prison. Page 13, the coming of the Third Reich. And Pope Leo XIII spoke of it in his encyclical issued in 1886. A new political party was formed to help defend the rights of Catholics. This was called the Catholic Center Party. Despite the party's wishes, the conflict was largely resolved by Pope Leo XIII himself in the late 1880s, leading to an outburst from the Center Party leader. Shot at the front, shot at from the rear, I'm going home. This is important to note, as while there was common ground between the Center Party and the Vatican, Rome was not calling the shots within the party itself. There were those who self-identified as Catholics but had extremely unorthodox and anti-Rome primacy, or anti-ultramontane, beliefs as well that we will touch on. Despite the resolution, tension still remained with the Catholic Church and the German state, and this culture war remained in the memory of German Catholics for the next generation. One area that was not fully resolved was with the investiture of bishops. Hubert Wolff writes on this matter. In fact, the Catholic king in Bavaria was even able to nominate bishops, whom the Pope had only the power to confirm. In the remaining territory, which was generally under the control of Protestant rulers, the cathedral chapter's right of election was maintained simply because Rome was not prepared to surrender the nomination rights for Catholic bishops to Protestant sovereigns. Nonetheless, the Pope did concede to Prussia, as well as to the Upper Rhine states of Baden, Württemberg, and Hessen, that the cathedral chapters would not elect a candidate to bishop who was, quote, less than agreeable, end quote, to the state. This concession essentially gave the states veto power. A Protestant king or duke could demand that any Catholic candidate whom he considered disagreeable be stricken from the electoral list of the cathedral chapter. This meant that no Catholic bishops could be seated in Germany without the consent of the state, regardless of whether it was ruled by Catholics or Protestants. Pages 44 and 45, Pope and Devil. Bishops were still primarily chosen by the German state rather than by the Vatican. Hence, you have a figure like Adolf Bertram as head of the German episcopate, despite Eugenio Pacelli's, the future Pope Pius XII, very low opinion of him prior to the Nazis taking power. Part of this opinion was driven by Bertram's closer ties to the German state rather than to Rome. Pacelli wrote in 1929, in addition, His Eminence Bertram has a pronounced tendency to do everything himself, while in the process gladly ignoring the Holy See whenever possible, except in such cases where he needs it in order to cover his own responsibility. This is page 49, Pope and Devil. So while the Catholic Center Party in theory owed loyalty to Rome, even the bishops in Germany had mixed results on that matter. Jacques Kornberg, in his work, documents the results of papal influence in political affairs. I will also note this is the best book on the Pius Wars I've read thus far. An example of this would be the German invasion and war crimes in Belgium during the First World War. Belgium was an overwhelmingly Catholic country. Both the Germans and the Belgians wanted papal support to be on their side of the war. Rather than pick sides in the war, Benedict XV elected to be above the politics and remained strictly impartial to care for the spiritual welfare of the Catholics on all sides. This was likely a wise choice, as Germans were prioritizing national needs above religious and spiritual. German Catholics were more likely to turn against the papacy than to turn against their nation at that point. Kornberg quotes Bishop William. If an angel of heaven told them their beloved armies had murdered the innocent, desecrated churches, violated women and children, they would receive the message with derision and reject the messenger as an emissary of Satan. Page 197, The Pope's Dilemma. I will also point out something rather prophetic Benedict XV did say in the midst of World War I. Nor let it be said that your immense conflict cannot be settled without the violence of war. Lay aside your mutual purpose of destruction. Remember that nations do not die. Humbled and oppressed, they chafe under the yoke imposed upon them, preparing a renewal of the combat and passing down from generation to generation a mournful heritage of hatred and revenge. This is the Apostolic Exhortation, July 28, 1915. Needless to say, Benedict XV's words ultimately fell on deaf ears. An example of papal interference in German affairs that does not go well after World War I is also included in Kornberg's work. This would be the occupation of the Ruhr by the French in 1923. For context, Germany was struggling to keep up with reparation payments after the war, and the French elected to occupy an industrial area to enforce the payments. German nationalists resisted this occupation and even became violent at times. Pope Pius XI issued a pastoral letter in which he tried to advocate for a middle ground. He cautioned against excessive nationalism, advocated for patience in payments, but also emphasized the need to atone for past faults. As you can imagine, with growing nationalism at the time, this was not going to be well received. Resistance to such guidance was loud and immediate, and the Pope was being viewed as meddling in international affairs where it was not warranted. One would expect this coming from a primarily Protestant country like Germany, but this was the attitude among prominent politicians in Catholic France. Yes, all of the Catholic French politicians, with the exception of Marc Sangnier, discounted the Pope's caution against excessive nationalism. Here are some quotes from the French deputies. There is no such thing as immoderate love of the fatherland, but the patrie, fatherland, is an idol. This is why I'm skeptical of Richard Evans' claims of papal influence on the Catholic Center Party in Germany. If a significant majority of France was at least nominally Catholic, and the Pope had such little influence on their political affairs, how could one expect more influence from a population where at most 40% were Catholic? Hubert Wolff writes, even though the 1917 General Instruction to Pacelli had noted that the Center Party was the only acceptable political grouping in Germany, relations between the Center and the Roman Curia were never free of tension. The Pope did not favor an independent party that was controlled primarily by the laity and not directly beholden to the church hierarchy. Page 65, Pope and Devil. I want to try to focus on the people within Germany, so to speak. I've spent quite a bit of time in a previous video referencing papal statements against excessive nationalism, and I don't want to repeat too much. I'll slow down as I approach the 1930s as the popularity of the Nazi Party really takes off, and focus more on the underlying principles, which may be too strong a word, of the Nazi Party in the 1920s. We begin with the end of World War I. Germany after World War I was rather chaotic, which has been well documented. One of the troubling trends present underneath all of the animosity was how casual political violence was becoming. Political parties utilized paramilitaries to literally fight their battles in the streets. Matthias Erzberger was a Catholic Center Party deputy who was part of establishing the Weimar Republic and was assassinated in 1921. Dietrich von Hildebrand recalls his shock at how casual not just the public but even a priest is with this unjust murder. He writes, but the case of Erzberger was different. He had done nothing to harm anyone, had for years served as a legitimately elected member of the Reichstag, and had become minister in a constitutionally legitimate manner, governing without even the faintest hint of a dictatorship. And those who killed him, Tillerson and Schultz, embodied a spirit totally unlike that of the pious and conscientious Arco. Their words, "the pig must be slaughtered," betrayed the depth of the awful, base, petty, and criminal spirit that animated them. I was terribly upset by what even Catholics said to me at the time. The ordinary man on the street is not upset by this murder, I would hear, for he sees how many people died in the war. How can one more death really matter? As if the decisive factor was not the murder itself. On one occasion, a Catholic, a priest I fear, said to me, "This won't stir up the people. They'll say, one Jew, more or less, is of no consequence." Page 30, My Battle Against Hitler. The last line there is interesting, as von Hildebrand isn't clear that Erzberger himself was in no way Jewish. Richard Evans writes about how race was often assumed just by politics. After the war, the widespread belief on the right that the German army had been stabbed in the back by revolutionaries in 1918 translated easily into anti-Semitic demagogy. Leading politicians who signed the treaty, like Matthias Erzberger, were not Jewish at all. Page 150, Coming of the Third Reich. Again, I'm not going to touch too much on the obvious anti-Semitism that is present in this attitude. My point is just to underline the nonchalant attitude present to political violence. Evans speaks about how, in the 1920s, anti-Semitism was important only for a minority of the true believers of the Nazi movement. He writes on page 218, among ordinary party activists in the 1920s and early 1930s, the most important aspect of Nazi ideology was its emphasis on social solidarity, the concept of the organic racial community of all Germans, followed at some distance by extreme nationalism and the cult of Hitler. Anti-Semitism, by contrast, was of significance only for a minority, and for a good proportion of these it was only incidental. So with that, let's focus on the Catholic attitudes and teachings toward nationalism and the concept of race. Nationalism had been condemned by Pope Pius XI in no uncertain terms in his first encyclical in 1922. Patriotism, the stimulus of so many virtues and of so many noble acts of heroism, when kept within the bounds of the law of Christ, becomes merely an occasion, an added incentive to grave injustice when the true love of country is debased to the condition of an extreme nationalism, when we forget that all men are our brothers and members of the same great human family, that other nations have an equal right with us both to life and to prosperity, that it is never lawful, nor even wise, to dissociate morality from the affairs of practical life, that, in the last analysis, it is justice which exalteth a nation, but sin maketh nations miserable. Pacelli, the papal nuncio at the time, seemed to agree, as did Michael Faulhaber, the Archbishop of Munich. Robert Ventresca writes about how despite how brief Pacelli's reports are on the early Nazi movement and Hitler, but he did recognize the anti-Catholic nature of the radical authoritarian nationalism espoused by the extreme right, as witnessed in the rhetorical attacks leveled against Cardinal Faulhaber, Archbishop of Munich, who had publicly criticized radical nationalists' attacks on Jews. The lesson Pacelli took away from the abortive beer hall push, which confirmed him in a view first formulated in 1917, was of the inherent dangers of an inflated, aggressive nationalism. As he wrote to Gaspari in May 1924, nationalism might be the most dangerous heresy of our time. Pages 61 and 62, Soldier of Christ. Ludendorff, a co-conspirator with Hitler on the beer hall push, actually blamed the failure largely on Cardinal Faulhaber, leading to increased attacks and derision directed towards him. Derek Hastings also writes, when Faulhaber criticized what he saw as excessive nationalistic posturing on the issue of Germans living in the Italian-controlled South Tyrol, Faulhaber called it pathological nationalism, the Beobachter mobilized immediately against Faulhaber, calling his perspective not only wrong, but dishonorable. In addition to personal attacks on his honor, Faulhaber was openly labeled a hypocrite and, in a barely veiled insinuation, characterized as nothing more than a common liar. Page 159. Catholicism and the Roots of Nazism. Hastings' work is interesting. His argument is that the Nazi movement in Munich early on was distinctly Catholic in at least some respects. The reason I don't want to talk about it too much is because despite calling themselves Catholics, I don't think the leaders of this movement would qualify as Christian with how unorthodox their beliefs were. Hastings writes, in the midst of diatribes against Jews and Marxists, Schleicher was not afraid to tread openly on shaky theological ground by insisting that Christ was not Jewish but in fact a Galilean Aryan from Nazareth whose racial identity stood in stark contrast to the racially inferior Jews of Jerusalem. Was Jesus a Jew? We know that it is the Spirit that bestows life, Jesus' Spirit and Jew Spirit. Is any greater contradiction imaginable? That is why the Jews attacked, persecuted, and drove to a shameful death the Savior of the world, the Galilean. They never counted Jesus as one of their own, because he was not a Jew, neither in spirit nor in body. Pages 56 and 57, Catholicism and the Roots of Nazism. The figures in this early movement were also anti-ultramontane. They would not respect the authority of the Pope and repeatedly emphasized the welfare of the German nation being of primary importance. Throughout Munich's pre-war Reformed Catholic community, a steady yet dramatic escalation of Volkisch and eugenics rhetoric is visible in the years leading up to the First World War. One of Joseph Schnitzer's most devoted students within the Kreisgesellschaft, Leonard Fendt, virtually apothesized Germanic racial identity in a striking 1907 article attacking, yet again, the evils of ultramontanism. Fendt argued, the whole of Catholicism is more Roman today than ever. We are Germans, and it must be admitted from the bottom of our hearts that if we were free to decide between Roman and German Catholicism, we Germans would be religious traitors to opt for the Roman type. Pages 38 and 39, Catholicism and the Roots of Nazism. While this predates World War I, it is a good summary of the problems of the movement prior to the beer hall push. Too much emphasis on German nationalism, flagrant disobedience to Rome, and anti-Christian ideas contorted to seem consistent with the Catholic faith. The nationalistic rhetoric was often driven by paranoia regarding the international influence of the Jews and the Jesuits as well. So, when this documentary describes Germany as one of the most Catholic countries in the world,
et l'Allemagne qui est le plus important pays catholique.
From a strict numbers perspective, it wasn't true, and you have to take into account this subculture that, while they identify as Catholic, bear little resemblance to the Pope's idea of Catholicism. Of course, that's not to say there weren't prominent theologians who were anti-ultramontane and also anti-nationalism, or that the Jesuits don't also have their own failures regarding race during this era. My point here is twofold. It's much easier to contort Christianity to suit your needs if one is being anti-ultramontane. Nationalistic fervor was so high as to cause those who identified as Catholic to reject ecclesiastical authority for the sake of the country or race. So not only was there a papal statement, but multiple prominent figures in the church hierarchy, in Munich no less, where the beer hall push would take place, critical of the foundational aspects of National Socialism. This would also include Dietrich von Hildebrand, a professor at Munich recalling a meeting he attended in France in 1921, in which he speaks about the invasion of Belgium. I stood up again and said that was an atrocious crime. Thunderous applause greeted my words. I continued, I have no problem in admitting that it was a dreadful crime, for I am first a Catholic, then a Catholic, and yet again a Catholic, and so on and on. Page 27, my battle against Hitler. Hildebrand paid for that applause, as he referenced later receiving career impediments as a professor due to his speech. This is at least plausible, given what's contained in Richard Evans' book. The vast majority of professors, as their collective public declarations of support for German war aims in 1914 to 1918 had shown, were also strongly nationalist. Page 132, The Coming of the Third Reich. And according to the memoirs, I can't speak to the accuracy, Hildebrand was well known by the early Nazi movement to warrant fleeing Munich during the push. This section of my research reminded me of a quote from Emma Federini's work talking about Achille Ratti, the future Pope Pius XI, his experience as a diplomat in the highly Catholic Poland around the same time. The future Pius XI instead criticized the superficiality of faith, excessively devout and too easily bent to political plans of the nation. In this, his first fundamental political experience, Ratti saw and feared an external faith operating as a tool of politics, a Catholicism that was too generic, too emotional, irrational. This is on page 26 of Hitler, Mussolini, and the Vatican. I will run through a few of the papal statements against the concept of race. What races? They are all sons of Adam, whom God created. What does it matter if human beings in different latitudes differ in color and aspect? Their souls are all molded with the same spiritual substance. Why do we send missionaries to heretics and savages? Because all human beings, without exception, are God's creatures. The only difference is that some are fortunate enough to know the true faith and others are not. They are all equal in the sight of the Lord, because the existence of them all is the outcome of his will. Pope Leo XIII, an 1892 Figaro interview. Certainly he does not fulfill it who thinks that charity pertains only to those who are related in tongue or race. For if, as Christ says, you love those who love you, do not the publicans do so? And if you salute your brothers only, do not the pagans do so? For to be sure, a characteristic of Christian charity is that it extends equally to all. For, as the Apostle warns, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for there is the same Lord of all, rich to all who invoke him. Pope Leo XIII, Reputanibus, 1901. Nevertheless, though much has been done for the Indians, there is much more that still remains to be done. And indeed, when we consider the crimes and outrages still committed against them, our heart is filled with horror, and we are moved to great compassion for its most unhappy race. Pope Pius X, Lacrimabili Statu, 1912. But in reality, never was there less brotherly activity amongst men than at the present moment. Race hatred has reached its climax. Peoples are more divided by jealousies than by frontiers. Within one and the same nation, within the same city, there rages the burning envy of class against class, and amongst individuals it is self-love which is the supreme law overruling everything. Pope Benedict XV, Ad Beatissimi Apostolorum, 1914. And one more quote from Richard Evans for good measure. Fundamentally, racial hygiene was born of a new drive for society to be governed by scientific principles irrespective of all other considerations. It represented a new variant of German nationalism, one which was never likely to be shared by conservatives or reactionaries or endorsed by the Christian churches or indeed by any form of organized or established religion. Page 38, The Coming of the Third Reich. It is possible to be anti-Semitic without treating the Jews as a separate race. I reiterate that is a topic that will be covered another time. I'll return back to the idea of political violence and how that had long been condemned by the Catholic Church. To quote Richard Evans, the cult of violence, derived not least from the Free Corps, was at the heart of the movement. By 1929, it could be seen in operation on a daily basis. The Nazi movement despised the law and made no secret of its belief that might was right. Pages 229 and 230, The Coming of the Third Reich. And here is the Catholic teaching consistently reiterated by the popes at the time. Hence come contempt for laws, insubordination of the masses, wanton criticism of orders issued, hence innumerable ways of undermining authority. Hence, too, the terrible crimes of men who, claiming to be bound by no laws, do not hesitate to attack the property or the lives of their fellow men. Pope Benedict XV, 1914. To cast aside obedience, and by popular violence to incite to revolt, is therefore treason, not against man only, but against God. Pope Leo XIII, 1885. On the contrary, there has been born a spirit of violence and of hatred, which, because it has been indulged in for so long, has become almost second nature in many men. Pope Pius XI, 1922. While it's fair to say bishops like Faulhaber and von Galen were certainly not fans of the Weimar Republic, they did not advocate for a violent revolution against it. So to be clear, the foundational principles of Nazism are flatly in contradiction with Catholic doctrine, irreparably from the start. Before we get to the electoral gains of the Nazis in the 1930 election, I would like to discuss Heinrich Bruning as Chancellor. Bruning is a key figure to understand both the Nazi rise to power and how the history of the Concordat has been written. Bruning was a devout Catholic and a member of the Center Party. However, he made several key miscalculations after he became Chancellor in March 1930 that helped pave the way for the Nazi takeover. First of all, Bruning is described as a fair-weather friend at best of the Weimar Republic by Richard Evans. This certainly wasn't uncommon among Germans at the time, but his lack of commitment to the democratic institutions set some dangerous precedents. Bruning would describe himself as a monarchist in his own memoirs, and one of his goals as Chancellor of Germany was to re-establish the monarchy. He introduced restrictions on the freedom of the press in March 1931. He cut government expenditure in the middle of the Depression, causing deflation. He reduced unemployment, causing more financial stress for those hardest hit. Given the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, Bruning refused to print money to create more jobs. Evans describes this as the most disastrous long-term effect of Germany's inflation. Bruning's mismanagement caused the Depression to become even worse under his helm, and he expected it to last until 1935. Despite some efforts to curb the violence of the Nazis in the 1930s, Bruning increased the authoritarian nature of the German government, restricted civil liberties, and sharpened economic decline, pushing more people to the Nazi Party. He resigned in May 1932, but his role in the story is far from complete. As part of his attempts to get the Social Democrats in line and his first year as Chancellor in 1930, he called for Reichstag elections, which ended up disastrous. In 1928, the Nazis had only received 2.6% of the vote. The crisis yielded more extreme parties getting a large swath of the vote in the 1930 election. The Catholic Center Party increased its share of the vote from 3.7 million to 4.1 million. However, the Communists, who explicitly rejected the foundation of the Weimar Republic, raised their Reichstag seats from 54 to 77. The Nazis also increased their share of the vote, going from 0.8 million votes in 1928 to 6.4 million in September of 1930. It's important to note the majority of those voting for the Nazi Party were not Catholics. Richard Evans writes, "Whether its voters were men or women, young or old, the Nazi Party did particularly well in Protestant North Germany, east of the Elbe, and much less well in the Catholic South and West. Yet contrary to a widespread contemporary view, the Nazis did not do any better in small towns than in large ones overall. The effects of religious allegiance, which meant that a Protestant vote was twice as likely to support the Nazis as a Catholic one, were far more important in rural areas, perhaps because the influence of clergy was greater in the countryside and secularization had made greater progress in the towns, whatever their size." Page 262, The Coming of the Third Reich. Given the size of the party prior to this, there's few, if any, explicit mentions of it among the German bishops. After this election, this changed. On September 30th, 1930, the Vicar General of Mainz condemned the Nazi Party, quote, "because the program of the NSDAP contains precepts that are irreconcilable with Catholic doctrine and principles," end quote. The declaration also criticized, quote, "overestimation of the Germanic race and the denigration of all foreign races, that in many lead to complete hatred of foreign races," end quote. I want to underline this. Catholic bishops were speaking out against Nazis as soon as they were reaching electoral relevance. In November of 1930, Cardinal Faulhaber described National Socialism as, quote, "a heresy," end quote, and stated, quote, "it cannot be brought into harmony with the Christian worldview," end quote. The Bavarian Conference of Bishops to Clergy on February 10th, 1931 stated, quote, "Catholic clergy is strictly forbidden to participate in the National Socialist movement in any form. Participation by National Socialists in religious services in closed ranks under uniform and banner is and remains forbidden," end quote. And one more quote from the Bishop of the Upper Rhine on March 19th, 1931. "Bishops, as shepherds and preachers of the Catholic faith and morals, must warn against National Socialism because of and as long as it pursues and spreads views that are irreconcilable with Catholic teaching. It is therefore forbidden for Catholics to accept these views as true and to profess them in word and deed." Next, we will examine how the Catholic Center Party reacted to those gains. At the end of 1930, the Chancellor of Germany was Heinrich Bruning, who was a member of the Catholic Center Party. As a note in Bruning's favor, he was an opponent of the radical nationalism of the right wing in Germany. Evans writes, "Like many traditional conservatives, Bruning wanted to curb or emasculate the rabid radicalism of the extreme right, and at times showed some courage in attempting to do so." Page 255, The Coming of the Third Reich. Joseph Goebbels also described Bruning in his diary in April 1931 as, quote, "our most dangerous enemy," end quote. However, there were some whisperings of a potential coalition with the National Socialists shortly after the election of 1930. By the beginning of 1931, these talks had fallen through. Hubert Wolff writes, "In January of the following year, Orsenigo had to report that these talks had failed. The center had been forced to recognize the impossibility of political collaboration with the NSDAP, particularly since the latter had done nothing to invalidate the charges contained in the Mainz Declaration." This is page 142, Pope and Devil. While the Center Party didn't have much love for the Nazi Party, Bruning did underestimate the power of the movement and Hitler, and was far from the only one in Germany at the time. Robert Ventresca quotes Bruning responding to inquiry regarding a coalition with the NSDAP, "No, never, under no circumstances. The National Socialist movement is a symptom of the fever of the German people that will soon disappear again." Page 74, Soldier of Christ. As for the Vatican reaction, the new nuncio Cesare Orsenigo seemed somewhat hopeful early on for collaboration between the Nazis and the Center Party. He seemed naive in his hope that a faction of the party more friendly toward Catholicism would win out and be amenable to collaboration. After this fell through, the Nazis tried to downplay the bishop's condemnations that happened after. Bruning does reference a meeting he had in which Pacelli insisted on forming a coalition with the Nazi Party to get a Concordat signed. I'll get into why he did this when talking about the Concordat later, but Ventresca would point out that people often contort this meeting to make Pacelli appear more eager to work with the Nazis than he actually was. In 1931, Pope Pius XI issues "We Have No Need" as a warning against the pagan worship of the state. This encyclical was no doubt targeted at Mussolini, but it does echo much of the same criticism that will be launched at Hitler's regime in a few short years. And here we find ourselves confronted by a mass of authentic affirmations and no less authentic facts, which reveal beyond the slightest possibility of doubt the resolve, already in great measure actually put into effect, to monopolize completely the young from their tenderest years up to manhood and womanhood for the exclusive advantage of a party and of a regime based on an ideology which clearly resolves itself into a real pagan worship of the statolatry, which is no less in contrast with the natural rights of the family than it is in contradiction with the supernatural rights of the Church. There was seemingly very little influence from Pius XI and Eugenio Pacelli, who in 1930 became Cardinal Secretary of State, essentially the number 2 position in the Vatican, to move the German bishops one way or another in regard to the condemnation of National Socialism. Hubert Wolff writes, "At the end of 1931, members of the German high nobility requested that Pius XI lift the Church's condemnation of National Socialism. When Pacelli presented him with a letter to that effect in an audience, the Pope realized that he had run out of room to maneuver and commented that all he could do now was refer them to the decision of the bishops." Pages 149 and 150, Pope and Devil. In addition, Hermann Goring of the Nazi Party attempted to set up a meeting with Pacelli in 1931. Pius XI correctly snuffed this out as an attempt by the Nazis to undermine the German bishop's condemnation. Hubert Wolff writes again, "The Pope rejected the idea of a personal meeting with Goring out of hand and forbade Pacelli to receive him as well. It is a dangerous matter because it seems to go against the decision of the bishops," the Pope told Pacelli. Page 149, Pope and Devil. With that, we shift to 1932. Before returning to the governmental situation in Germany, I want to draw attention to a particular bishopric the Vatican did play a role in. That is Bishop Conrad von Preysing, who will play a key role in the Catholic Church's relationship with Nazi Germany. Before he was the Bishop of Berlin, he was merely nominated for Bishop of Eichstätt in 1932. Because of the terms of the Bavarian Concordat of 1924, the papacy had much more power in selecting bishops for this particular region. 3 candidates were selected and Prime Minister Heinrich Held interceded with Rome, requesting Ludwig Brugier to be appointed. Pacelli declined this intercession. Not only that, but he continued elevating Preysing after his outspoken criticisms of Nazism, with his appointment to Berlin in 1935. While Pacelli may not have known the extent of the Nazi excesses in the near future, his admiration for Preysing should be noted at this date. As stated before, Bruning resigned as Chancellor in May of 1932. Franz von Papen was to fill his shoes as Chancellor, and proved to be a fateful choice for the Weimar Republic. Richard Evans writes regarding his appointment, "These events marked, explicitly as well as in retrospect, the end of parliamentary democracy in Germany. Most members of the new cabinet were without party affiliation, apart from a couple who were, nominally at least, members of the Nationalist Party." Papen and his fellow ideologues, including Schleicher, saw themselves as creating a new state above parties, indeed opposed to the very principle of a multi-party system, with the powers of elected assemblies even more limited than they had been in Bruning's more modest vision. Page 284, The Coming of the Third Reich. The Nazis also completely rejected the Weimar Republic, although they had different ideas of governance than Papen. To win greater support for this dissolution, elections took place in July 1932. This election was a watermark for the Nazis electorally. Goebbels was gaining skill and precision in his propaganda. Hitler toured the entire country giving speeches, and the ban on brown shirts was lifted, which allowed for violence to be unleashed once again. Evans writes about the July 1932 election. This unprecedentedly intense electoral propaganda soon brought its desired result. On the 31st of July 1932, the Reichstag election revealed the folly of Papen's tactics. Far from rendering Hitler and the Nazis more amenable, the election brought them a further massive boost in power, making them by far the largest party in the Reichstag, with 230 seats, nearly 100 more than the next biggest group, the Social Democrats, who managed to limit their losses to 10 more seats and sent 133 deputies to the new legislature. Page 293, The Coming of the Third Reich. The Nazis achieved 37.4% of the vote, more than doubling the staggering 1930 result of 18.3%. The Communist Party also made massive gains in this election, increasing the number of deputies in the Reichstag from 77 to 89. The Center Party increased slightly, gaining 75 representatives. Once again, while the Nazis did gain in this election, they did not gain from Catholics primarily. Evans writes again, "The Nazi Party continued to be attractive mainly to Protestants, with only 14% of Catholic voters supporting it as against 40% of non-Catholics." Page 294, The Coming of the Third Reich. According to Evans, the Republic was doomed to some form of authoritarianism at this point. At least according to Hubert Wolff, there still was little involvement or even discussion in the Vatican. Surprisingly, the increasingly difficult political situation in Germany never again came up in 1932 in discussions between Pacelli and the Pope. Page 150, Pope and Devil. Papen was outmaneuvered by Goring, and the Reichstag called for a vote of no confidence in the government. Rather than abolishing the Reichstag, elections were called for November of 1932. 1932. The Nazis actually took a step back in this election. Hitler's attacks on von Papen's government turned some voters off, and by this point, Goebbels' propaganda methods were being copied by other parties. Pacelli was keenly aware of the situation in Germany and accurately predicted this. Pacelli predicted that the National Socialists would lose votes in the upcoming elections and that the Communists would gain. The center would surely lose several seats that it had won in the previous election as a result of favorable circumstances. In addition, he told Charles Rowe of the Center Party's rejection of the government of Franz von Papen and the impossibility of building a majority coalition consisting solely of the Center and Papen's DNVP, pages 139 and 140, Pope and Devil. Following the election of November 1932, Papen had lost the confidence of the Reich President Hindenburg. He resigned and General Kurt von Schleicher took over as Chancellor. He was the final Chancellor before Hitler. There's more that could be said about the political intrigue in the 6 months prior to Hitler taking power, but my point is that none of these figures, von Papen, Schleicher, Hindenburg, had any sympathy of a representative democracy at this point. Removing the context around this and acting as if the Enabling Act were some revolutionary measure that snapped an otherwise healthy Weimar Republic in half is not history. We now shift to the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, following Schleicher's resignation due to his inability to win the support of the Nazis. I submit it is dishonest to begin the story here without understanding the history of the Catholic Church in Germany or the prevalent disillusion regarding the Weimar Republic. Hindenburg and von Papen certainly underestimated their abilities to control Hitler, but they knew the representative democracy was essentially done. Even before the Reichstag fire, Hitler turned up the heat on political rivals. Evans writes, "The intensity of the violence increased considerably when Goring, acting as Prussian Minister of the Interior, ordered the Prussian police on the 15th through the 17th of February to cease its surveillance of the Nazis and associated paramilitary organizations and to support what they were doing as far as they were able." Page 318, The Coming of the Third Reich. This included the Catholic Center Party. Evans again writes, "The Center Party, like the Communists and the Social Democrats, had proved relatively immune to the electoral advances of the Nazis, and so was another prime target for intimidation in the election campaign. Already in mid-February, 20 Center Party newspapers had been banned for criticizing the new government. Public meetings were forbidden in a number of localities by the authorities, and a wave of dismissals or suspensions of civil servants and administrators known to be Center Party members had begun, including the police chief of Oberhausen and a ministerial director in the Prussian Interior Ministry. A speech by Heinrich Bruning condemning these dismissals sparked violent attacks by stormtroopers on Center Party electing meetings in Westphalia." Page 322, The Coming of the Third Reich. Interestingly, the Center Party seemed more defensive of the Weimar Republic than Evans alludes to. According to Hubert Wolff's account of Orsenigo's first report after Hitler's appointment on February 7th, the Center, which distrusted a Hitler-Papen cabinet for reasons of program and tactics, made its collaboration contingent on several factors. For one, the party demanded guarantees that the Weimar Constitution would be retained. The Nazis balked at this condition, and Hitler was forced to announce new elections. Pages 155-156, Pope and Devil. As one may imagine, the violence against political opponents was not reduced after the Reichstag fire, February 27, 1933. Communists were the primary targets of this violence, but the decree following the attack gave far more leeway to the violence that was already taking over the German political world. The dubious elections of March 1933 gave the Nazis the perception of a majority coalition between themselves and the Nationalist Party. They achieved 52% of the vote, which would be considered a disappointment with all of the terrorism being inflicted on all other parties, especially the Communists. Joseph Goebbels, in a press conference even stated on March 15, 1933, "The Nazi Party will not be satisfied for long with the knowledge that it has 52% behind it, while terrorizing the other 48%, but will, by contrast, see its next task as winning over that other 48% for itself. It is not enough to reconcile people more or less to our regime, to move them towards a position of neutrality towards us. We want rather to work on people until they have become addicted to us." Page 396, The Coming of the Third Reich. Recall, the Enabling Act is passed on March 23, 1933. Goebbels is admitting in a press conference, not in his diary, that the government is terrorizing half of the population that did not vote for either the Nationalist Socialist or the Nationalist parties. This would include the 5.5 million voters for the Catholic Center Party. Richard Evans writes again, "The escalating terror to which Catholics and their political representatives, newspapers, speakers, and local officials had been subjected to since the middle of February made the Center Party look anxiously for guarantees that the Church would survive." Page 352, The Coming of the Third Reich. I want to draw attention to a few of these Catholic figures that were persecuted by the Nazis at the time. Dietrich von Hildebrand was professor at Munich and had to flee to Austria, where he set up an anti-Nazi newspaper. Fritz Gerlich was imprisoned in early March 1933. He was remembered for having written a satirical article asking if Hitler had Mongol unalloyed blood in 1932. The internet did not deserve this man. He was killed in 1934, in the Night of the Long Knives. His blood-spattered spectacles were sent to his wife. This is the context surrounding the Enabling Act that this video flagrantly disregards. Now we arrive at the first point initially discussed in the video, the Enabling Act. To quote Richard Evans on what the Enabling Act sought to do, this Enabling Act would have to be renewed after 4 years, and the existence of the Reichstag itself, the upper legislative chamber representing the federated states, and the position of the Reich president was not to be affected. What it meant, however, was that the Weimar Constitution would be a dead letter, and the Reichstag would be shut out of the legislative process altogether. Page 351, The Coming of the Third Reich. While Nazis were throwing legality out already with the imprisonment of communists who certainly would have opposed the vote, they still wanted to pressure the Center Party to vote for the act to give the illusion of a law-abiding government. Every single member of the Center Party voted in favor of the act. Historians debate the reasons why. Ventresca, to his credit, is fairly mild in his suggestion. He writes, Monsignor Ludwig Cass was the indispensable conduit between the Vatican and the German Catholic political parties in the months following Hitler's rise to power. As newly appointed chairman of the Center Party, Cass enjoyed a unique position with a foot in two complicated worlds, the Roman Curia and German parliamentary politics. A certain degree of mystery still shrouds Pacelli's influence over Cass and, in turn, Cass's dealings with the Hitler government in the spring of 1933. On balance, the evidence suggests that after the national elections of March 1933, which saw the Nazis fall just short of a clear majority in parliament, Cass, with Pacelli's support, resolved to seek some kind of working arrangement with the Hitler government and its coalition partners. Page 78, Soldier of Christ. Ventresca is a good historian and is careful about overstating his position on this matter. He is aware of Hubert Wolff's work on this subject. Richard Evans published his work prior to the Vatican archives being open, and given the scope of the work, I'm a bit more forgiving. He writes, the promises, combined with heavy pressure from the Vatican, proved sufficient to win the Center Party deputies over to supporting the measure that in the long run was bound to mean their own political demise. Page 352, The Coming of the Third Reich. The main source used by proponents of the theory that the Vatican exerted pressure on the Center Party is Heinrich Bruning. Bruning is incredibly critical of Pacelli in his memoirs. I will quote Jacques Kornberg. Bruning denounced Pacelli in a memoir published in 1970, the year of his death. His memoir carried weight, coming as it did from a former German chancellor who had dealings with the key players of the day. He mentioned a meeting with the Vatican Secretary of State in August 1931 when Pacelli had demanded that Bruning form a Center Party coalition with the right, including the National Socialists, with the understanding that such a coalition would push through a Concordat. Page 51, The Pope's Dilemma. In Bruning's version of events, Ludwig Cass, the head of the Catholic Center Party in Germany, serves as an intermediary between the Nazi Party, more specifically Franz von Papen, and the Vatican. He would keep negotiations secret, but would convince the Center Party to vote for the Enabling Act in exchange for the Concordat, as he would leave for Rome the day after the Enabling Act was voted on. There is some interesting circumstantial evidence around this, and the testimony of someone like Bruning's prominence warrants serious consideration to the theory. Bruning, however, has his own issues, as discussed before, with his own mismanagement, bringing rise to the Nazi Party in government. He did have a vested interest in distancing himself from the rise of the Nazis, and Pacelli proved to be a useful scapegoat. Kornberg writes again, Bruning, seeking vindication, pinned the blame on Pacelli for sinking the Weimar Republic. Though Bruning's evidence does not hold up, this did not stop others from citing him, for so great was the Pacelli myth, which assumed his superhuman control over events, his hypnotic hold over Catholics, and his desire to snuff out democracy and crush all centers of Catholic political power for the sake of a Vatican agenda. Page 52, The Pope's Dilemma. Kornberg points out the evidence surrounding the Vatican involvement in the vote for the Enabling Act is all circumstantial. There's no clear or direct link from Pacelli to the German government. Even this terrible documentary on YouTube acknowledges that.
It's impossible for historians to know in what ways the Vatican and Eugenio Pacelli put pressure on the Centrum.
Or maybe they didn't put pressure. Just a thought. The theory relies on Cass being nothing more than a puppet to Pacelli. The Enabling Act was voted for by the Catholic Center Party due to their fear of further violence against their institutions and attempting to mitigate a situation that was getting bleaker. If Joseph Goebbels had no inhibitions about acknowledging the terror being inflicted on half the population a week before the vote, it's unlikely the Center Party rejecting the act would put a substantial roadblock on Hitler's quest for power at that point. Hitler was not so subtly threatening bloodshed if the vote did not go his way. Kornberg also points out how in the minutes of the Center Party meetings on March 22nd and 23rd before the vote, there is no reference in that discussion of a grand bargain for a concordat with the Nazi government. The Center Party's vote was a moral failure, but there were mitigating factors and they absolutely acted independent of the Vatican and the bishops. I will close with a quote from Kornberg. As Ludwig Bolk has underlined, the Center Party approval of the Enabling Act was no grand bargain for a concordat, but a disaster for the German Church. the Enabling Act made a Concordat an urgent matter of self-preservation. With the Enabling Act, the Church no longer enjoyed the protection of the Weimar Constitution, which had secured its confessional schools, its youth, workers, and cultural associations, as well as the Weimar Concordats with Prussia, Bavaria, and Baden. Page 60, the Pope's Dilemma. That now brings us to the rationale of the German bishops for reversing their condemnation of the National Socialist Party on March 28th. At the beginning of March, Pope Pius XI was actually praising Hitler for his attacks on communism. Hubert Wolff writes about this. It is therefore not surprising that the first sentence in Pacelli's notes about the audience of Pius XI on that day read, "Hitler is the first and only statesman who has to date spoken publicly against communism. Until now, only the Pope had done so." Page 158, Pope and Devil. This is a statement that is often used to justify that the Vatican must have put pressure on the German bishops to overturn their ban on National Socialism or strong-arm the Catholic Center Party. However, one must recall the Pope refused to receive Goring, in part because it would seem to go against the German bishops. Pius XI is also praising a very specific aspect of Hitler. Similar sentiments were made in Cardinal Faulhaber's notes in a visit he had to Rome around the same time. Faulhaber was asked by Pacelli to give his opinion on Hitler. Faulhaber gave 3 aspects of Hitler as praiseworthy: courage to proclaim the name of God in speeches, opposed to Marxism, intended to overthrow capitalistic economic order. Looking at the negatives, Faulhaber has much more to say. Let me know if any of this sounds familiar. Preaches wild hatred and methods of violence, highly critical of prominent Catholic figures in the Catholic Center Party, preached the cult of race, rejection of Christianity. Faulhaber reiterated what had led to the conflict with the bishops. National Socialism wants to be a new worldview, a new religion, and not just new politics. Page 163, Pope and Devil. Faulhaber seemed naive in hindsight as he muses the possibility of lifting the ban on National Socialism. If the new government demonstrates in fact that the fears of the bishops were unfounded, if, in addition, the new government continues to remain strong in the battle against advancing Bolshevism and public immorality, the bishops will gladly give up their distrust of the party. Page 164, Pope and Devil. Obviously, these fears represented the fundamental principles of National Socialism, and yet the condemnation was still lifted. What do the Vatican archives say on this matter? Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria had an audience with Pacelli in March 1933. Ruprecht asked about cooperation with the new German government. Here's what Hubert Wolff writes. Pacelli's answer was clear. I answered the minister that the declaration, referring to Hitler's speech about Christianity, in Parliament was, in my opinion, satisfactory, particularly with regard to the Catholic Church. But as far as questions of conscience are concerned, I answered that I cannot anticipate the decision of the bishops. Page 165, Pope and Devil. So while the Vatican is sufficiently pleased with the platitudes and lip service Hitler was giving at the time toward the Catholic churches, Pacelli was clear that they would not override the German bishops on the matter. Hubert Wolff continues regarding internal discussions within the Curia. However, he firmly rejected any direct intervention by the Holy See or its on-site representative. Intervention by the Pope is neither necessary nor advisable, Pacelli noted at the audience. Page 167, Pope and Devil. So, if the Vatican did not instigate the reversal of the bishops' ban on National Socialism, what caused it? Well, we will first have to turn back to the March elections of 1933. While generally the Catholic Center Party held their vote steady, in part due to the urging of the bishops to avoid straying to the Nazi Party, there was fear that many members of the church were falling away. Hubert Wolff writes, on March 7th, Orsenigo reported to Pacelli that only about half of German Catholics had followed their bishop's instructions and voted for the Center or the Bavarian People's Party. The other 6 or 7 million Catholic voters had largely voted for National Socialism, in spite of the unambiguous ban by the German episcopate. Even though these figures are clearly too high, and recent studies have shown that at most 4 million of the total 13 million Catholic voters cast their ballots for the NSDAP, these exaggerations enabled the Berlin nuncio to convey to Rome the particular fascination that National Socialist ideas held for German Catholics. Page 158, Pope and Devil. With these fears of defections, it's important to keep in mind the invasive aspects of the Nazi Party during this time too. Not only was there violence, but the Nazi Party members were showing up to Mass in SA uniforms despite knowing the bishop's objections, brought swastika flags to funerals, and deputized SA units as auxiliary police so they legally could not be denied sacraments. While Hitler's words about Christianity were empty, treating them as such would easily be perceived as disloyalty to the state, as Catholics had long been given a reputation of in Germany dating back to Bismarck. Kornberg lists the criteria various German bishops had for when a reversal of the condemnation should be given. Adolf Bertram, recall Pacelli's writings about him before, ultimately won out, thinking such an act would give the church more bargaining power with the regime. By May, there was universal regret over this decision. Bishops knew they were beating a retreat, and this led to self-reproach at their next meeting in Fulda in May 1933. The bishops worried that they had just squandered their trust with the faithful, backing away just when those most loyal to Catholic interests had been dismissed from government posts and arrested and beaten in the waves of terror before and after the 5th of March election. Page 63, The Pope's Dilemma. And Pacelli, while he received Hitler's assurances with mild positivity, was disappointed at the speed of the retreat of the bishops. Wolff writes, when on the same day, March 31st, 1933, During an audience, the Bavarian ambassador Gronesten raised the question of the German bishop's declaration. He expressed the opinion that he had found it a little confining and confusing and would have preferred a freer version. Whereupon the Cardinal's Secretary of State expressed cautious, one might say diplomatic criticism of the starry-eyed approach taken by the German episcopate. I told him that in my opinion, and as far as I can judge, it would have been better if the bishops had demanded clear statements from the government about certain points before they retracted their condemnation of National Socialism. Page 169, Pope and Devil. The German bishops rescinded their condemnation for a variety of reasons. These would include pressure from the Nazis themselves, fear of appearing disloyal and subversive to the quote-unquote legitimate civil authority, and naivete that such concession would breed goodwill from the Nazis in the future. The Vatican not only had no hand in the decision, but thought it unwise to give in as quickly as they did. It was driven by a figure that was made bishop more by state intervention than by the Vatican, and Bertram's sympathy to the German nation led to a great miscalculation. We now turn to the terms and negotiations of the Concordat itself. To begin with, a Concordat is not a friendship treaty. A Concordat does not indicate the support or endorsement of a particular government or form of government. Pope Pius XI's mania for Concordats is summed up in an often quoted line: "We would deal with the devil himself in a Concordat if it meant saving one single soul." I previously mentioned Pius XI's praise of Hitler due to his public statements against communism. Pius XI was certainly no friend of communism or the Bolshevik Revolution, yet he did commission Pacelli in secret in 1925 to negotiate a Concordat with the Soviet Union. With that in mind, this Concordat had been in the works for a long time dating back to the 1920s. It wasn't signed for a variety of reasons, including the anti-Catholic nature of the Social Democrats that often made up the coalition of working parties with the Catholic Center Party. The Nationalists on the right side of the political spectrum also didn't want to sign the Concordat for being anti-Catholic for Protestant reasons. Pacelli sums up the problem the Catholic Party faced in the 1920s well. It is correct that the parties of the right, a large majority of which, though not all, consist of Protestants, are frequently hostile to the Catholic Church, and that they apply their furor Protestanticus even to the detriment of their own interests for the sole purpose of fighting their detested Rome. Nonetheless, the atheistic and materialistic socialists, the Social Democrat Party, who have temporarily moderated their attacks for primarily tactical reasons, are no less rejecting of Catholic principles. It appears from experience that, though fraught with difficulties, the probability of a good Concordat, think of the one earlier concluded with Bavaria, and school laws that favor confessional schools, currently the two most important religious questions, is greater through an alliance with the German National People's Party than with the Socialists. Page 71, Pope and Devil. Ultimately, no Reich Concordat would come during the 1920s due to the difficult situation and hostility toward Rome from both sides of the political aisle, and many competing priorities Germany was facing at the time. Returning to 1933, the first time the Concordat is mentioned in the archives is April 8, 1933. Wolff highlights two key points each party insisted on in sort of a quid pro quo. Catholic institutions, schools, and organizations were protected against the Nazi aggression spreading across the entire culture. Catholic clergy were forbidden from participating in politics. The motivation for both parties insisting on these 2 points should be obvious. The Nazis were in the process of rapidly consolidating into a one-party state, and the Church wanted to avoid repeating the history of the Kulturkampf. The negotiation regarding removal of the clergy from politics took some time, and the Vatican was not eager to comply. April 20th, the Holy See would require clergy to seek bishops' permission to engage in political activity, rejected by the Nazis. May 11th, language was added that permission would be seldom granted or granted in individual cases, rejected by the Nazis. June 20th, ban on running for parliament or holding offices conceded. Dispensations could be granted with agreement between the Reich and Vatican, rejected by the Nazis. July 5th, the Center Party dissolves itself, the last political party to do so, yielding main incentive Nazis were looking for in signing the Concordat, before the Concordat is actually signed. Ventresca writes, in fact, in his negotiations with the Hitler government, Pacelli was showing more resolve than Bruning realized. For instance, when Hitler insisted that any treaty contain an explicit ban on clergy and politics, a stipulation of the Lateran treaties, Pacelli held firm to the view that such exclusion made sense only in countries where Catholics were in an overwhelming majority. Pages 81 and 82, Soldier of Christ. He continues, in its approach to the Hitler government, Pacelli reasoned, the Vatican took its lead from the German bishops, who agreed that a treaty was, quote, the last hope, end quote, for the Church in Germany, and the only way to avert state-sponsored anti-Catholicism that would be even worse than the Kulturkampf of Bismarck's time. Page 83, Soldier of Christ. Pacelli was not rushing into signing the treaty by any means. He defended and attempted to hold out for the rights of Catholics to participate in politics. The bishops also wanted the Concordat due to their miscalculation in lifting their ban on National Socialism and giving up their leverage. He emphasized on multiple occasions that the Concordat did not represent an endorsement of Hitler. He expressed disappointment at the Center Party's dissolution and the German bishops' lifting of the ban. He lamented having to sign the agreement agreement while clergy and Catholic leaders were imprisoned in Nazi Germany and considered not signing for this reason. Richard Evans writes, the Catholic Center Party, newspapers were being banned or taken away from it, its local and regional organizations were being closed down one by one, its ministers in every state had been removed from office, its civil servants, despite constant reassurances from Hermann Goring, were under continual threat of dismissal, its 200,000 members were resigning from the party in ever-growing numbers. From May onwards, leading Catholic politicians, lawyers, activists and lay organizations, journalists and writers were arrested as well, particularly if they had published critical articles about the Nazis or the government. Page 364, The Coming of the Third Reich. Pope Pius XI and Pacelli both shared an affinity for concordats, but both seemed to realize the corner they were backed into and reluctantly agreed to the offer in an effort to give some relief to the organizations being persecuted. Kornberg writes, according to Ivan Kirkpatrick, then charge d'affaires at the British Embassy in the Vatican, Cardinal Secretary of State Pacelli declared he did not believe the responsibility of power would moderate Hitler and was even pessimistic about whether the regime would adhere to the Concordat. But Pacelli said he had been placed on the horns of a dilemma, having to choose between a Concordat and the virtual elimination of the Catholic Church in the Reich. Page 64, The Pope's Dilemma. I would also like to point out there is no evidence that Pacelli or the Vatican initiated or wished to have the Center Party disbanded prior to the signing of the Concordat. In fact, the opposite is true. Pacelli had wished that the party would have held out longer. More from Hubert Wolff. What Pacelli was not willing to do was to capitulate on all fronts, as Gaspari was counseling, as a way of denying the National Socialists any pretext for attacking the Church. Rather, he saw the dissolution of the Center Party as a political bargaining chip for the clause in the Reichstag Concordat protecting Catholic associations. However, the Catholic Party thwarted his plans. The Center Party was unable to withstand the powerful pressure exerted on it by the National Socialists, and it dissolved itself on July 5, 1933, before the Reichstag Concordat was ready to be signed. This removed Pacelli's trump card. Rumors that the Vatican was behind the move have absolutely no basis in fact and fail the test of logic. Page 174, Pope and Devil. Again, this documentary references the letter by Gaspari, but neglects Pacelli's reticence in giving in on all fronts.
Il n'y a pas de document probant, sinon une note du prédécesseur de Pacelli à la secrétaire d'État, qui était le cardinal Gaspari, et qui écrit une note en 4 points et qu'il transmet par voie interne au cardinal Pacelli pour dire qu'il faut aller de l'avant avec les négociations concordataires et que si possible, il ne faut pas hésiter à, si le gouvernement allemand le demande, de sacrifier le parti des catholiques. Donc ce qui prime, c'est l'intérêt supérieur de l'Église et pas l'intérêt du parti des...
I will quote Kornberg here as well. The same applies to the Center Party's decision of the 5th of July to dissolve itself, 15 days before the signing of the Concordat between the Vatican and the new regime. Bézier quotes a long letter of Pacelli's in mid-July to Monsignor Lorenzo Schioppa, his former assistant at the nunciature in Munich, now papal representative to the Netherlands. In the letter, Pacelli vented his surprise and frustration over the timing of the Center Party's decision, and continued, they spontaneously, as I said, dissolved themselves, without informing the Holy See, which first learned of it in the newspapers. Page 70, The Pope's Dilemma. While the Vatican did view the dissolution of the Center Party as a bargaining chip, the way actions occurred demonstrates a reaction rather than orchestration on the part of the Holy See. There was no puppet master pulling the strings on all of these events. Each decision was made in an uncoordinated and haphazard way as a reaction to other decisions that occurred before. I sincerely looked for a study published after the Vatican archives were opened in 2006 that tried to argue the single-agent theory. I did not find one. The most respected academics who purported this theory, as far as I can tell, are Klaus Scholder and John Zinder. Ventresca cites both of them in his work, and while he does acknowledge the controversy, he doesn't provide an explanation for why he finds them more convincing. Understandably, it's a bit out of the scope for a biography about Pope Pius XII. Both of his sources published works prior to the opening of the Vatican archives. A few concluding thoughts from Kornberg and Wolff. The new sources strengthen the arguments of one side of the controversy, not Scholder's, but those of Repgen, Volk, and Morsi, that Pacelli, in seeking a concordat with the new regime, was no gravedigger of the Weimar Republic, no puppet master pulling strings, but simply responding to the collapse of the Republic and to the lead of German Catholics, the German Church hierarchy, and the Catholic German Center Party. Page 71, The Pope's Dilemma. Nor were Adolf Cardinal Bertram, the chairman of the German Conference of Bishops, and with him the German Episcopate, simply marionettes manipulated by a coldly calculating Eugenio Pacelli. The same goes for Prelate Ludwig Cass and the Center Party faction in the German Parliament. Both the bishops in their magisterial appraisal of National Socialism as a political party and as a religious worldview, and the Center Party representatives in casting their votes for the Enabling Act acted completely independently. Instructions from Rome did not influence their moves. Pacelli made some entries in his private diary to the effect that he had turned down several requests by ambassadors and concerned Catholics for the Holy See to exert influence on the center and the German bishops. Page 171, Pope and Devil. I'll throw in a few more scholars. Note, I haven't read the entire works referenced here, but the number who come to this view is worth showing. John Cornwell in Hitler's Pope argues that the Concordat was the result of a deal that delivered the parliamentary votes to Hitler, thereby giving him dictatorial power. This is historically inaccurate. Page 18, The Catholic Church and the Holocaust by Michael Feyer. But this trained jurist who, during the Weimar Republic, had negotiated with much skill and little success for terms less favorable than those being offered by Hitler, was at long last offered what he would refer to as a legal basis for relations between the Catholic Church and Germany. Faced with the prospect of increasing violence if the Concordat was not ratified, Pacelli embarked on his long and unhappy path down what has been rightly called a one-way street. Page 8, Hitler and the Vatican by Peter Godman. The bishops were worried that in addition to striking Bolshevism and Judaism, the new regime would attack Catholics as well, and this fear encouraged them quickly to conclude a Concordat. It was a Concordat that, as compared with that signed with Mussolini, served not so much to achieve the goals of the Church, but, in the words of Pacelli, to avoid greater evils. Page 110, Hitler, Mussolini, and the Vatican. Now that we've had our main course, we will move on to the low-hanging fruit for dessert. John Cornwell's book is bad, and full disclosure, I only read the first 150 pages or so, but it's bad in a more interesting way than I had thought. Cornwell's premise is essentially that Pacelli's desire to centralize power in Rome and reduce the authority of local church leaders led him to sacrifice the grassroots efficacy of local Catholicism in Germany and give Hitler unprecedented power. Throughout the first half of the book, he returns to the negative consequences of the consolidation of Vatican power. Cornwell himself seems to undercut his own premise in a later interview, talking about how little room Pacelli, then as Pope Pius XII during the Holocaust, had to maneuver. Evidence is significantly contorted in the book to suit this agenda. As you may have guessed, the anti-ultramontane tendencies of the early Nazi movement are never mentioned. Pacelli using his authority to elevate Conrad von Preysing is never mentioned, but Konrad Grober is, and is used to color Pacelli as sympathetic to Grober's later Nazi views. I'll also note Klaus Scholder describes the selection of Grober as, quote, clever and skillful, end quote. Pacelli did not have the sole discretion of appointment, at least according to the secular authorities, and chose a compromise candidate to avoid making waves, but still assert papal authority on the matter. It's never mentioned that Goring was denied an audience with Pacelli and Pius XI, partly due to the perception it would give of overriding the German bishops. It's a lot easier to make an argument when you just ignore counterpoints blatantly. At least some of your readers will accept it uncritically. Confirmation bias is only something other people have. Although I'm not sure if Cornwell had access, Pacelli's views of Bertram, including his criticisms of his theology in his final report as nuncio to Germany, are never mentioned. He has not seldom shown himself inadequate to the task of defending the faith against erroneous modern teachings, possibly as a result of deficiencies in his theological training. Eugenio Pacelli on Cardinal Bertram, taken from page 49 of Pope and Devil. Given the clear papal statements on race, this undercuts the idea that Pacelli shared the racially problematic views of Bertram, as Cornwell alleges he did by putting them on the same side of an issue defending German citizens from alleged attacks by North African soldiers. In addition, when discussing Pacelli's aggressive negotiation for the Concordat, Bertram is the reasonable one. No consideration is given how the state's influence on bishopric appointments benefited him, and Bertram may be protecting his own self-interest. Ludwig Cass is not an independent person, but a vessel to which Pacelli's views are contained and espoused and nothing more. Bruning is painted too sympathetically. His viewpoint of Pacelli is exactly what Cornwell wants. The fact he helped Hitler write speeches and supported his foreign policy declaration in May 1933 is conveniently ignored. Fritz Gerlich's imprisonment is discussed in the context of the persecutions happening in May and June of 1933. It actually occurred on March 9th, 1933, but that undercuts the importance Cornwell places on the Enabling Act. Unsurprisingly, a primary source of Cornwell is Klaus Scholder. Indeed, Cornwell says his greatest debt is owed to Scholder. Scholder is a respected academic historian, and his work is serious. The problem is, Scholder's careful and hedged statements become hyperbole in Cornwell's popular work. In addition, Pacelli comes across as a cartoon character with impossibly powerful persuasion, and it's easier to paint him that way while ignoring the violence the Nazis are unleashing on the Center Party and lay Catholic organizations, even before the Enabling Act. It's the equivalent of discussing the evil rationale behind the internment camps in the United States during World War II without acknowledging Pearl Harbor. Cornwell takes the completely wrong lesson away from something like papal interference in the Ruhr occupation and can't help but to portray the Vatican as sympathetic to the Germans when they were trying to steer a middle course, and how Catholic France completely rejected the proposal out of hand, minimizing the authority of the papacy in the process. The French rejecting papal interference by Pope Leo XIII to give their support to the Republic undermines the political power of the papacy that Cornwell is trying to build up so much, as does the reaction to Pope Benedict XV's call for peace during World War I, while Bishop Faulhaber of Germany is calling it a just war. The popes failed to maneuver politically in all these cases, and yet Pacelli completely controls the Catholic Center Party, the German bishops, and the Catholic laity to be loyal to this regime for the sake of a Concordat. If that sounds implausible, it's because it is. This is to say nothing of how Pius XI had little to do with these decisions as well. Pius XI knew everything. His illnesses didn't flare up until late 1936, but Cornwell is having fun with this supervillain he created. If only that man were more heroic and not burdened by his dogmatic beliefs, could he have saved the whole world from World War II and the Nazis. The book is more fan fiction than history, and it's not helped by the fact that Cornwell goes out of his way to talk about how good faith he is in the opening.
I would like them to take back the Concordat made with Adolf Hitler, the first treaty he ever signed, giving the church a monopoly over education in Germany in exchange for the dissolution of the Catholic Center Party to give the Nazi Party a clear run.
So Hitchens in less than 13 seconds made a statement that required about an hour to fully and charitably rebut. I hope it's clear that he too often resorts to hitch slaps to win over a general audience and shouldn't be taken seriously when it comes to Catholicism. That concludes the topic of this video. The next will likely focus on the role of the Catholic Church in Nazi Germany prior to the start of World War II. This may shock you, but there's a lot more to discuss than birthday wishes to Hitler.